You're listening to Speak Lord. I'm Ryan Rogers. Have you ever wondered how the Bible can tell us the scariest of things and then tell us to not be afraid about it? Last week we talked about the church in Ephesus, and that's actually the first of 7 letters to churches in the book of Revelation. We're going to look at all 7, and today we're looking at the letter to the church of Smyrna. Remember, this is a personal letter from Jesus to the church of Smyrna. Wouldn't that be awesome to have a personal letter from God? It would be pretty awesome, but not if that letter was full of really scary things. Just listen to this message that Jesus had for the church in Smyrna.
You are about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Be faithful, even to the point of death. Now remember that Jesus knows everything, so when he says you're about to suffer, it's not like he's giving some misdiagnosis or he just doesn't quite understand what's going to happen. He knows your future, and he's telling you there's some really difficult, scary things ahead. But right before he says that, he says, do not be afraid. And we also know from verse 9 that they experienced afflictions and poverty. So the church of Smyrna was struggling with some stuff. And the letter from Jesus says it's about to get worse. So how is it that Jesus can say really scary things and then tell us to not be scared by it? Well, there are some powerful answers to that question right in this message to the church of Smyrna. To begin with, listen to how Christ identifies himself. He says, "These are the words of him who is the first and the last, who was dead and came to life again." So remember, his message is that they're going to die, but they shouldn't be afraid. Well, it adds a whole lot of credibility when the person telling you that message has died and defeated death and is now alive. He is credible. You can listen to someone like that. If I came along and told you this message, you could say, well, easy for you to say, you're not the one dying. But Christ did die, and he rose again. And he also promised life. He is the resurrection and the life. At the end of verse 10, he says, be faithful even to the point of death, and I will give you the crown of life. Suffering and death and persecution, that's scary stuff. But when we have a promise from God that there's a crown of life on the other side, it's not so scary. The message to the church in Smyrna concludes like this: he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes will not be hurt at all by the second death. I won't be hurt by the second death, so I won't fear death now. There are some scary things ahead of us. There are people close to us who are dying. Or maybe you're facing the reality that you're living your final years or your final months or days. And maybe when you look at your future, you see a lot of suffering and not a whole lot of good news. We don't have to fear death when we have the promise that the second death will not hurt us. We don't have to fear death when we have the promise that on the other side, we receive a crown of life. We don't have to fear death when the one who's telling us to not be afraid has conquered the grave. This world is so full of bad news. And some of that bad news is probably stressing you out right now. And I imagine Jesus looking at all that trouble. He knows all about it. And looking at more trouble to come. He knows all that too. And still being able to say, don't be afraid. And if he can see it all and tell me not to be afraid, I'm going to trust him. How is God speaking to you? Speak, Lord. Your servant is listening.
You can find more of Speak Lord at PastorRyanRogers.com or by searching for Palmer SDA Church wherever you get podcasts.